Hi, welcome back to Frank's Vinyl Review. It's been a few months since my last video. I do apologize to my subscribers, especially if you've been sitting around and waiting since June 10th. That was my last published video, so I do apologize. It's summer. Today's actually the first day of autumn here in the Northeast United States, and it's a beautiful day. We've had a great fall. Where I am, it's actually a little bit dry, so we haven't had rain for a while, so we're kind of trending towards a drought, although I think we'll be getting some rain later on this week. But getting back to Frank's Vinyl Review, and so I chose you guys, coming back again 3 months away. I wanted to review this record that I've had in my collection for a few months. It was released, I forget exactly, at some point this year. I'm sure you have remember all the hype surrounding this when it came out, because original pressings are hard to find. And this is Joe Henderson, Power to the People. Joe Henderson's, a lot of jazz critics consider this maybe his magnus opus. It features Herbie Hancock on piano and electric piano, Ron Carter on bass and electric bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums, and I might be butchering his last name, and then an obscure trumpet player named Mike Lawrence. And I just wanted to mention that Joe Henderson had just played on Herbie Hancock's album called The Prisoner, which kind of, both of these are sort of, statements about what was going on in society. And 1969, this one was recorded in May, specifically May 23rd and the 29th in 1969 at Plaza Sound Studios. And just to provide some musical context, it was recorded 3 months after Miles Davis, his record In a Silent Way, which Herbie Hancock also played on. And that album, if you haven't heard it, I'm sure most of my listeners have, or at least have heard of it. It is a fusion album, and it's got some real ambient sounds. I mean, it's really its own thing. I mean, Tony Williams is on drums, but it's its own thing. And if there's one track I'd recommend on that one, and this is the first track that I heard on that, it's called It's About That Time. Just a great, so this album, continues in that direction, the direction that Miles started. Probably, I mean, a lot of musicians kind of contributed to the fusion movement, if you will. But Miles, his album, In a Silent Way, and the albums that preceded In a Silent Way, Miles had been playing in this sort of different fusion style for almost 2 years. And even the vibranist Gary Burton, his debut album on RCA, Duster, that's considered, I've read articles that say that's the first fusion album, if you will. And I think Larry Coryell is on that album. So kind of an interesting, just a quick snapshot of fusion. But anyway, getting back to this record, Joe Henderson, Power to the People, again, considered one of those fusion classics, and I can definitely hear why. I mean, I listened to this yesterday, and I enjoyed it immensely. I mean, it was just stimulating the whole way through. There was just some great music that we're going to talk about, and here's a picture of the inside sleeve of the gentleman who played on the record that I mentioned earlier. So really good stuff here. So this was a reissue, and I just want to touch base on that real quick. So this was a Kraft Recordings reissue, and they generally do a pretty good job. I don't really like plastic record sleeves, so what I typically do is I'll cut the hype sticker right off and put it in the gatefold, if you will. But this hype sticker says the Jazz Dispensary Top Shelf Series, tenor sax legend Joe Henderson's politically charged hard bop classic. And there's some hard bop there, there's some post bop, there's some fusion, You know, there's some free jazz. I mean, it's like a kind of a mixed bag, but very new. I mean, this album was recorded in 1969, in May of 1969, but it still, to me, sounds incredibly fresh and contemporary. And maybe it's perhaps because of the electric instruments. So two out of the 7 tracks did feature electric instruments, and we'll touch base on that. So let's jump right in here into my notes. So the first song on the album is called Black Narcissus, and it opens with what sounds like a Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter tritone-like motif. Nice light playing by Henderson. They drop into a kind of modulating theme before returning to the opening theme. And, you know, to me, Ron Carter, he just sounds amazing right out of the gate. And, you know, since we're on the topic of Ron Carter, I just wanted to mention I finally did see his PBS documentary this past summer called Finding the Right Notes. So I highly recommend that one. It's on PBS, so if you have a Roku TV or your phone or whatever, definitely check it out. It's a great documentary on Ron Carter, long overdue. So he's on this album. So definitely check it out. It's called Right Notes, Finding the Right Notes. Anyway, Henderson continues to lay down some nice lines, and Herbie at this, on this song, he's very subtle with his playing. There's a nice drop-in lines, again by Ron Carter, followed by Herbie on electric piano. So, you know, it's interesting, you hear that electric piano pretty early here. And while Herbie's on the electric piano, the way Ron Carter, he's sort of sliding into the notes on his bass, so it kind of creates this interesting effect. They reprise that opening tritone, if you will, and the recording sounds great. And again, this was my first time hearing this record, and I was pretty excited by that opening track. The second track on the album is called Afrocentric, and this is Ron Carter on the electric bass. And so this one and track 5, the 2 tracks that are electric, this track and Power to the People, the title track, where Ron Carter is actually playing electric bass. Herbie's still on the electric piano. Mike Lawrence, who I hadn't really heard much of before this listening, is adding some interesting lines on trumpet. And he, essentially, Joe Henderson discovered him playing in Manhattan and brought him into his band, and that's why he's on this album. But pretty obscure, you know, he's not as famous as other trumpet players, but you know, probably more on the fringe, if you will, in terms of the mainstream trumpet player. But still great. I mean, he plays some really great stuff here. Henderson begins a pretty long solo, very jarring, and you know, you hear the music that's going on underneath is very active, and it's really cool hearing Ron Carter on the electric bass. I think he does a pretty good job. Again, really nice mix, good separation between the instruments. You know, Herbie Hancock and Joe Henderson had been playing together. Joe Henderson had appeared on Herbie's Blue Note album called The Prisoner, which was recorded 1 month prior in April of 1969. So, you know, musically at this time, Herbie and Joe Henderson were pretty close. Henderson plays on The Prisoner, and then a month later, Herbie sits in on Henderson's album. And both are great albums, and both kind of tie into each other in terms of that activism, if you will. So Herbie's got, you know, he's on the electric piano, and he's playing some really nice stuff. I mean, he's got some really nice runs, and I mean, he's got such great range, you know. And if you know anything about him, you know, he trained as a classical pianist, and you know, he's just got this huge vocabulary. Again, more great Ron Carter underneath, and you know, those guys, Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter, they'd been playing, you know, with Miles Davis going back to May of '63. So literally, they had 6 years of playing. They're bringing 6 years of their, you know, sort of gestalt, if you will, into this session. And you know, from this song, this is sort of what we would hear, and this song has a similar sound and vibe to what we will hear on Bitches Brew, recorded 3 months later in August, mid-August 1969, but it's definitely here on this one. And look at the players, you know, Herbie Hancock was in on that. John DeJohnette, I think his name is John. Yeah, Jack DeJohnette sat in on some of the Bitches Brew as well. So it's easy to hear why, really, when you think about the players. Track 3 on side 2 is called Opus 1.5. Pretty chill opening, you know, especially after that raucous last jam, if you will, that last track. Henderson opens with some pretty nice lines, punctuated by Herbie Hancock back on acoustic piano, and the end notes he was using were really interesting on that. Really hard to describe what was going on there, but definitely check it out. Henderson's got a really nice sort of floaty tone. He's got some really nice vibrato, and you know he was very patient, but just really locked in. I mean, at times his horn was just sort of floating along, if you will, and notes were kind of waving. You know, Ron Carter, he's back on acoustic bass, and he's just killing it. I mean, you know, that's his number one instrument. He did experiment with electric bass obviously on this album and some other albums, but the acoustic bass really is his baby. It's like an extension of himself, really. You know, Henderson, again, he's in full command. He's got great tone, and you know, he hits some really cool low notes as well, just sort of showing that range, if you will. Herbie chimes in with a nice solo of his own, still pretty relaxed but very expressive. You know, Herbie's just he brings the sort of X factor, if you will, to any session or any, you know, when he sits in on an album, you know, he's definitely going to bring something, and he certainly does here on this track. He and Joe Henderson play off each other, and Joe then harmonizes with Ron Carter's bass line, which is kind of cool. And that's sort of coupled with some pretty cool descending piano by Herbie. And then Joe Henderson ends the song with like kind of an Eastern sounding line, which I thought was kind of cool. The last track on side 1 is called Isotope. This one had a pretty fast, you know, a quicker beginning, sort of a very, you know, you could feel this sort of swing feel early on. It was like hearing them back on the bandstand. You know, everything else up to this point is pretty experimental, and this is just kind of them going back to their roots. And then, you know, Ron Carter does a quick little bass solo, and DeJohnette, sorry, pronouncing his name correctly. To me, he sounded a lot like Tony Williams with his hi-hat and cymbals. Just a lot of really fast, you know, just that signature Tony Williams sound. More great ideas by Ron Carter on the bass. And at this point, Henderson's playing some really long legato type lines. Again, showing his great tonal range from low to high, followed by, you know, these bursts of sound, if you will, almost like he's painting. And again, he hits this really, really fat low note, which I just love. It's almost, you know, you hear Sonny Rollins doing that a lot. And I just love that range, if you will. It just kind of shows his mastery of the instrument. Henderson, then he goes into some Coltrane sounding like lines, and Herbie Hancock is, you know, comping underneath with really brilliant drum runs by DeJohnette in between. So really nice track and a pretty solid side 1. I was pretty excited about that. Moving on to side 2, flipping the record over. Side 2 opens with the title track, Power to the People. This is the other electric track on the album. Has a very cool opening, almost kind of mystical lines by Herbie Hancock, and had some interesting bass counterpoint by Ron Carter, who's back on electric on this track. There's an almost sort of triumphant feel in the lines, and the horn lines, in the melody. Herbie Hancock sounds a lot like Alice Coltrane on the electric piano, like some of his flourishes sounded very harp-like, if you will. And, you know, Henderson sounds very much like John Coltrane. So it's kind of an interesting sound here. Again, Ron Carter, he sounds great on the electric bass, and him and Herbie hook up really nice. It's just great music all around on this track. At one point, Henderson's playing these screeching, haunting lines, combined with everything else. This is sort of a torrent of electric sounds. Again, DeJohnette is just doing great work on the drums and cymbals. Ron Carter continues to play some really nice bass, and then Mike Lawrence gets a nice solo, and he's really laying it all out. Herbie's really building tension underneath when Lawrence is soloing, and he's really impressive here, and he's been really impressive on this whole album. Herbie takes another solo, and again you hear DeJohnette underneath, just killing it underneath. Herbie's whizzing around on his piano and builds a nice progression, a really nice chordal progression, if you will, just building tension. DeJohnette responds, and then you can hear Ron Carter. He's playing some really nice bass harmonics, which I haven't really heard a lot of that in jazz music necessarily, like even in acoustic stand-ups. But so it's really cool. It stuck out to hear Ron Carter playing those harmonics on the electric bass. But again, just adding more color. They reprised the main theme, and the whole band, they just build tension. And Ron Carter's holding it down throughout this last tension build, if you will, with that bass line. And again, nice work by Herbie on the electric piano. And then, so the track ends with some of Ron Carter's bass harmonics, and a really cool way to end an absolutely smoking track. And I can see why Joe Henderson and the people at Milestone picked this as the title. It's just a great track, and I highly recommend it if you love jazz, if you love fusion, and if you love music, electric music, just music in general. Just check it out. The next track on side 2, it's a track called Lazy Afternoon. This one, again, like the last track on side 1, Isotope, had kind of more of a swing feel right out of the gate. High register lines by Joe Henderson early on. More interesting piano work by Herbie in between, and Ron Carter, he's back on acoustic, but and this song did have kind of a lazy but kind of sunny afternoon feel and vibe. It wasn't definitely wasn't cloudy and rainy on that afternoon. So there is, and sort of underline that, DeJohnette, he's so active underneath, and Henderson's playing some really interesting lines, and again you can hear Henderson's vibrato as sort of the track fades out, so it's kind of cool to hear that. And the last track on the album in side 2 is called Foresight and Afterthought, and I guess this was more of a free jazz track for them. DeJohnette starts off pretty active early on, and he sounds kind of like a boxer, someone who's sparring with some of his drum lines. Ron Carter jumps in, and he really propels the track forward, and DeJohnette responds, and there's really charged playing by him. Joe Henderson at this point, he's all over it. He's just, and the music's very subtle but powerful, and Ron Carter, he's underneath. He's playing some nice stuff. There is a reprise of the main bass line by Ron Carter. DeJohnette is coming in with his cymbals. Henderson's playing some more subtle lines. And then it kind of breaks down to a trio. It's Henderson, DeJohnette, and Ron Carter, just them three playing as a trio. Really nice percussion at that point by Jack. And and then the track sort of fades quickly, but then it comes back in loud, and Ron Carter and Joe Henderson, again, they're dominating the soundstage. Nice lines by Henderson. He gets some nice peaks, kind of bluesy, but just different, transcendent. More legato lines by Henderson. He's really showing his depth and range here, and again, it's very clean playing. And he's. It sounded like at one point Henderson was playing the cycle of fourths or fifths, and then Ron Carter and DeJohnette are just absolutely killing it underneath, which sets up a long atonal run by Henderson. And then the track fades with Ron Carter on bass. And after that initial sort of volume, you know, it sounded like the track faded and then came back loud. As a listener, I'm waiting. I thought it was going to happen again. I thought there was going to be another cycle, but that track ended the album. And you know, as I stated in the beginning and the intro to this one, this was a great album. You know, the two electric tracks are probably my favorite, Afrocentric and Power to the People. And you know, they definitely foreshadowed the sort of the music we heard on Bitches Brew. But I feel like Power to the People can stand on its own against any fusion track, you know, before or after. It's definitely, it's a monster, and it's great music. You know, as I mentioned during the video, you know, Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter, you know, they were just becoming more and more immersed in the fusion music. And DeJohnette, it's such a tough name to pronounce. I should have just said Jack the whole video. Anyway, you know, and he was a big part of that as well with Miles. And you know, this is obviously a Joe Henderson record. I've been talking a lot about these other cats, but you know, Joe Henderson, you know, to me, he was very much in command of his saxophone, both in range and vibrato and composition. He wrote a lot of the tunes. Just a great album. You know, I highly recommend it. It's out there in the bins if you guys, you know, it's a good pressing. You know, it's a you know, it's Craft Recordings. You know, I mean, they do a great job. So I highly recommend this one, especially if you're into fusion. I love jazz fusion. I love records like this, guys. I mean, yeah, we can listen to swing all day. I mean, and people love swing, and there's different periods of jazz, right? The bop period, the post-bop, the fusion, the free jazz. I'm a big fan of the you know, the free jazz, the fusion stuff. Not too free. You know, I do like some structure, but this stuff is just, and it's interesting, you know, thinking about when this one was recorded in May of 1969. I mean, man, there was so much good music going on in that month alone, right? I mean, you know, I'll just provide a couple rock examples just because we're talking about fusion, and there was this sort of this awareness and appreciation of rock music, right, as a standalone genre, and jazz, and both camps were reaching out and crossing the lines with each other. You know, there were rock bands like the Grateful Dead, for example, Jimi Hendrix, who were improvising on stage and doing these long improvisations, which were very jazzy in terms of you know, the idea of free expression, and just being completely free and wide open. And then the jazz cats at the time, they too were, I mean, they had this, you know, they had sort of the technical, I mean, both sides had you know, technical knowledge, if you will, but the jazz cats, they wanted to expand as well. I mean, they wanted to get into more of a rock sound, if you will, and they were becoming more influenced by electronic instruments, as we heard on Afrocentric and the title track, Power to the People. So there was a lot of cross-pollination going on, if you will, between those two genres, between rock and jazz, and sort of, you know, gave birth to the fusion, the genre of fusion. Anyway, guys, we'd love to hear your comments on this album, and you know, even if you want to say anything about the birth of fusion, if you will, you know, starting with Gary Burton's Duster album, if you will. But feel free to leave a comment. I'd love to hear some comments again about Joe Henderson. If you have another favorite Joe Henderson record, you know, from his Blue Note era, and I'm sure I'll review some of that as well. But again, just to wrap it up, guys, highly recommend this one, Power to the People. Really great music, and again, I thought Herbie Hancock was the MVP on this one. He just was playing brilliant the whole way through, and really brought an X factor to this record. So, all right, that's going to wrap it up, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in, and as always, I look forward to seeing you next time. And please like and subscribe, and have a great rest of your day. All right.